welcome to the Virtual FantasyCon 2017. This is our panel on fantasy mashups. For the definition of that, I was speaking in terms of something where you mesh fantasy with another genre in a single work. So my name is Diane Morrison. I'm the author of the Weird West Chronicles and the Toy Soldier Saga. Both of them, I think, could be considered fantasy mashups. The Weird West Chronicles is a blend of fantasy and Western with a little bit of post-apocalyptic and steampunk stuff thrown in there. And the Toy Soldier Saga is a fantasy space opera.
My name is Lyra Shanti, and I am the author of Shiva 14. It is a science fantasy, so a mashup right there. And it is the story of Ayn. He is the messiah, or would-be messiah of this planet. The priests there that raise him expect him to be the one who saves them and the entire universe from disease and war. He doesn't know how he's going to do that, but when he's 14, calamity strikes and he's thrown into an adventure he never could have thought possible. It takes him a while to discover who he is and how he's going to be this messiah. He meets strange creatures and friends along the way, and it takes about 4 books. The 4th one's coming out next month, November 6th. And there is a lot of mashup in this series because it has different ancient cultures that I've used for different races. It has mythology, it has fantasy, a whole bunch of different stuff that I love that I've thrown together for it.
Sounds like totally my cup of tea.
Okay, I'm Anita Stewart. I write under A.F. Stewart, and my mashup book is Fairy Tale Fusion. See? Anyway, and it's fantasy fairy tales and a mix of detective noir, and it tells the cases of Detective Piper, and it's written. It also has like headline news stories and little bites in between of different things like that, and it's got a lot of humor in it too, so there's that in the mashup as well. And then there's a bunch of other fantasy and stories in the back of it that mix in horror as well, so it's kind of a hodgepodge of a lot of genres.
That's cool. That sounds really interesting, very complex. It sounds like that sort of connects to the kind of thing that Sarah does.
Was that a hint? I write pretty much anything fantasy, and so most of what I write ends up being some sort of fantasy mashup. My main series, the Runespells, is probably the least mashy-uppy, and it's urban fantasy. It does have some suspense and thriller aspects to it, and some people have said that it has some mystery aspects to it. So I also write fantasy romance, fantasy erotica, fantasy with steampunk. I have one that I'm kind of still outlining that is a CIA kind of like Tom Clancy all the way kind of thing with fantasy. Paranormal horror I also write, so I just mash everything up. So.
You do it all!
That's
do. Cool. I had the pleasure of speaking with Asaf last night on our Realism in Fantasy Warfare panel.
Yep, that was quite a bit of fun. My name is Asaf Mer. I write historical urban fantasy. I mash up historical fiction set in Rome, detective mysteries, classical hardboiled detectives, and fantasy elements. So we have a paranormal detective operating in a fantasy world based on ancient Rome in Alexandria, with a touch of horror, because, you know, hey, why not?
A little more than a touch. I mean,
Lyra has read his stuff. Lyra knows.
I know enough. I'm so behind on my reading list, but I know enough to know that it's a little more than a touch.
Yeah, no. Apparently, some people ask for a disclaimer.
I'll put out a couple of questions to kind of try to encourage the discussion, but by no means do I want to corral it. The first thing I'll talk about, right? If we're talking about mashing up fantasy with other genres, what is our definition of fantasy? What is it that makes it a fantasy book?
Well, I mean, the first thing I think of course, is like, I think of high fantasy first. I think of swords and sorcery and wizards and all that stuff. I think pretty much most people do. And magic, lots of magic, and so I think with fantasy mashup, as long as it's got that magic element in the fantastical world and mixing it into whether it's science or horror or romance or all of it together, and like Asaf and I also trying to put in as much of like ancient cultures and in ancient history. It could be historical fantasy, all that, but really as long as there's the magic and that element of I guess that sword and sorcery stuff.
Yeah, I agree with that. If it's got the magic, for me, then it's fantasy, whether it's contemporary fantasy or urban fantasy or historical fantasy or whatever. As long as there's the magic or the strange creatures, or like the dragons or the vampires or whatever.
I would have to agree with that. Everything from the Fae to witches that can do anything more than like the psychic energy work that anything that makes it more magical. I have one that is kind of a sci fantasy where it's a subculture of people who do this psychic abilities, and they turn into crystalline beings when they do it. So that's
cool.
Weird creatures going on.
No, that's cool.
I'd actually expand this a little bit to anything that's fantastical rather than just magic. I mean, if you think of things like steampunk and the like, so it's a blend of historical fiction with technological elements, but there's no real science behind it. It's all just waving hands and, oh, look, it works.
That's true, because I've written
as long as you're not trying to explore.
Yeah, it's all smoke and mirrors with the steampunk technology.
Exactly. So I think as long as you're not trying to explore the effects of science on society, which is what normally sci-fi deals with, then you're into Fantasyland. And that's why, Star Wars is a fantasy, not sci-fi.
It's a little complicated when it's cutting edge sci-fi, like cutting edge science that hasn't really been explored. Or like we were talking about Dune yesterday or 2 days ago or whenever it was.
In our gender issues panel.
Right. You brought up the Bene Gesserits, and I started thinking about the Mentats. And because we were talking about how the Bene Gesserits are females who have that psychic power and all that, and then I said, oh, what, our men are presented as dumb, but that's not true. There's the Mentats. Yeah, that's like, it gets into that psychic stuff and how much of that is actually something that could be real.
Yeah. With the Bene Gesserits too, though, you also have the science aspect of it because of the genetic engineering portion of it as well.
Right,
so
that's unexplored, though.
Yeah.
I think the definition of fantasy changes because where's the line between fantasy and science fiction, right? Science fiction explores the possible, and fantasy explores as far as we know, it's impossible, but maybe, stuff that we considered, like the definition of it changes, right? In the 1970s, there was like parapsychology was a new field of research, and it was taken seriously, and it was a field of science, right? And so psychic books became a part of like psychic plot lines and psychic characters. That was part of science fiction. Nowadays, because parapsychology tends to be regarded among scientific types as being discredited, it tends to be more in the fantasy genre. But, the lines, it's liquid, it flows.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what it's going to be like 30, 40 years from now, what's going to be considered fantasy.
Well, faster than light travel is coming back into vogue in science fiction. They had written it off as, being completely impossible. So, okay, if it includes faster than light travel, it's fantasy, right? Or it's science fantasy, Star Trek, Star Wars, whatever, right? That's fantasy now more than science fiction, except that they're wrong. And the reason why it was written off has been discredited. And now it's starting to look like it might be possible again. and it's an active field research.
Well,
So
that's the problem with science. Science changes as the scientists discover new things. So, I mean, what was science a few years ago is now fantasy, and what was fantasy is now science. So you're right. The line is very fluid at times.
Right. I have to say that when I first started writing Shiva, that was 2010, 2011, I coined the term plasma as the energy source that they're all coveting. And I thought it was something so new and so amazing, and I'd never read about it. And then later I read about plasma, and I was like, oh, this is new cutting edge technology I'm talking about. Whoops. So it's funny that way. Sometimes I think that, like Wells, and not comparing myself, but like, things that we write about can actually be cutting edge and we may not even know it.
And let's not forget that, from a writer's perspective, it's hard to define it, but from a reader's perspective, a lot of readers aren't going to be sitting there picking things apart going, well, this is actually fantasy and this is actually science fiction. A lot of readers are into more of like this overall feeling of the book, like the way that it presents itself and the way that it just the kind of the way that the story flows, like there are certain plots that are very sci-fi, there are certain plots that are very fantasy, and as long as you stick with those, you can really fudge that line a lot, and people really just don't care.
Unless you get a hardcore sci-fi reader reading your stuff, and then they get mad, but
Right. You can never please every reader.
No, hardcore science fiction readers can be particularly brutal about their critiques. Sarah, you've got a point, right? You mentioned the feel. Now, fantasy literature tends to have a particular feel. I think in large part, Tolkien kind of defined it, which is why people tend to think of as the default fantasy as high fantasy, as you mentioned, sword and sorcery and great battles and whatnot. Now, I thought about that too, right? Because I agree that there's a certain feel that fantasy literature has to have, and where it becomes a mashup is where that may not be its primary feel, or where that feel is meshed into the feel of a different genre. For me, it's a mythological thing. Fantasy is a myth, right? And it tells a mythological story, and it has, when you're listening to it, it feels very much like, the Iliad. It feels like these great tales of, gods and, this big conflict, and ultimately it's about the hero's journey. For those who read Joseph Campbell are familiar with the, theory of the hero with 1,000 faces. So yeah, so that's for me where it becomes a mashup, right? If it's that and it's something else, or if the two kind of interweave, or
well, I think that it is that where you can play around with the feeling of it. You can play around with the the characters and the tropes that people might expect. I've read Diane's Weird West, and the characters have a very Western feel, and a lot of the dare I say tropes that are interwoven are very Western, but it is very obviously a fantasy. And, so you can play around with a lot of that when you're doing these mashups.
That's what I did with mine. When I was doing the detective stuff, instead of having the CSI, they had the fairy forensics.
That's cool.
That's good.
Yeah. And the Flying Broom Brigade. There was one story where they were chasing a dragon, so they had to call it the Flying Broom Brigade, and stuff like this. So I took like the standard detective tropes and I turned them all into fairy tales and into fantasy.
But would you say there's also still that detective story feel to it, right?
Oh,
like
yeah,
you've got your hard-boiled detective, and
yeah, the case files are all first person. I'm Detective Piper, and this is the thing. I did a very noir feel to the book of his cases he does, but they're all done in fairyland, and they're taking place. And Cinderella is the witnesses, and her pumpkin gets kidnapped and held for ransom, and things like this.
that's cool, right? So each of us, we do these different things where we're trying to mesh that feeling, right? Now, I've read a lot of Sarah's work. I found that her urban fantasy series had this kind of noir feeling to it. Her main character feels like a cynical, hard-boiled, I have seen it all type, right? She is done with this crap. She doesn't have time for your crap, you know, and all of a sudden there's like, you know, spells and deities coming out of the woodwork, and, you know, she's like, you know, and I love her attitude towards the deities too, right? She's as lippy to authority as a hard-boiled detective typically is in noir, right? She's like, I don't care if you're Odin, you know? All right, I respect you, but, you know, screw you, you know, or put me in this situation, right? And I love it. It's a lot of fun because it has that blend. So I think that's something that doing a mashup can give to a fantasy work, right? You can bring in other tropes and examine them in ways that break the mold.
I think it gets way more exciting that way. I get easily bored. So I like to have, when I'm reading as well, but writing-wise, I like to be able to play with everything, especially in that fantasy setting. The more freedom, the better for me. So yeah, if there's a fantasy trope or a fantasy thing that's typical, I would definitely enjoy throwing anything into it to make it more exciting. And, you know, not just to be trying to be unique, but just to keep it fun. I think that fantasy mashups, or any kind of mashups, any kind, it makes it, it's like putting spice in cooking, you know? Asaf, you would know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's, we end up writing the stories that we want to read. So we don't normally read just one particular genre. We tend to read a bit more and across and find out something, oh, you know, this could work out together with that, and those elements would be interesting to explore together. So it's the stories that we want to read. We explore based on our experiences and what's out there.
I may be making some assumptions here, but it seems that this panel is a little bit older than some of the other panels that I've been in. And so maybe we have all lived through the 90s.
Yeah.
Well, I just can't help but think that, you know, how much of, like, if you ever watched like the Animaniacs and, you know, the other cartoons from that era, they would do that all the time, where you'd have this episode where they're like, and it was a dark and stormy night. I was sitting in my office waiting for my next client. And, you know, you got Yakko, Wacko, and Dot playing out this film noir.
Pinky and the Brain did one on The Third Man. Yeah, The Third Man movie. They did a whole riff on that. Oh, was it brilliant?
I mean, Buffy. I mean, they did a musical, the first ever to do that. You know, I mean, talk about a mashup. It was great. Brilliant.
Buffy is a wonderful example of a mashup, I think. Buffy is a mixture of camp horror and teen cheerleader high school drama type stuff. And I mean, okay, we've seen it all before now, right? Like, there's a million books like this, but in the 90s, that was new. Nobody had ever done that before. That brings up another thing. I think that after a while, when you start to do these blends and challenge and expand the tropes, then they become their own genre in some cases. Steampunk, for example. Steampunk, is it fantasy? Is it science fiction? Both sides claim it. Where's the line? We don't know. Is it historical fiction? Well, it depends how accurately and how true to life it's written, right, Asaf? Like, you would agree with that, right?
Yeah, definitely. So steampunk is generally comes under the general historical fantasy subgenre. So I think it becomes a question of shelving. So historical romance, shelving. Is that romance under the genre of history, or is that history under the genre of romance? It becomes a mashup when, not when it's just how you arrange the shelves, but when it is like multiple shelves that it could go into. It's not just history and romance, it becomes, you know, and fantasy and swords and sorcery and sci-fi and whatnot. And it's like, yeah, I can't even arrange this in a tree. It's all just jumbled up in a heap there, so.
It's people like us who give Amazon and bookstores headaches, I guess.
What I think is interesting too is sometimes things will divide off and bud and become its own like time travel is something that Amazon considers to be its own genre. I never thought of that. I always kind of included it as, generally science fiction. Maybe it's fantasy if it's accomplished through fantastical means. I never considered it as a separate thing. But I suppose it is, because a certain trope develops over the process of a time travel story. And it generally deals with conflicts in terms of screwing up things that have happened in the past, or changing things that have happened in the past and see what the result will be in the future, or going too far in the future and then trying to prevent some future disaster, right? Like there's certain things that have become common tropes, and we recognize that as its own cycle.
Well, and you can take that even further. Westerns, why aren't they historical? Why are they their own genre? Why aren't they just histories?
Yes, actually, that's a good point. I thought about that one. I think it's because of actually, this has Hollywood's fault. The tradition of spaghetti westerns, right? The reason we're called spaghetti westerns, for those who may not be familiar, is that they tended to be directed by Italian directors. And what they were trying to do was they were trying to tell westernized samurai stories. That's what they were. They took samurai myths and samurai movies. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is a retelling of a samurai movie called Ojimbo, I think.
The Magnificent Seven.
Yeah, the Magnificent Seven.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right? What happened there is that in and of itself, it's already a mashup, because it's a historical fiction that took sort of an Asian culture of mythology and grafted it on. That's how it became its own thing, in a way, because it was already syncretic, right? It was already a blend of things.
Just don't tell the conservatives that they're really watching Asian movies.
I know they'll love that, won't they? It's a fact, but examples that come to my mind, right, when I'm thinking of pioneers of fantasy mashups. Anne McCaffrey was one of my early introductions to science fiction. I discovered her when I was about 9 or 10, and it reads like fantasy. Her Pern series, there's dragons, there's this big epic battle thing that they have to do, this huge existential threat that they have to protect the planet against, and everybody's kind of in a semi-medieval Renaissance type society, and all this stuff going on, right? But she was very adamant that she was a science fiction writer. Everything that had happened had a scientific origin. Dragons were originally genetically engineered by a group of colonists from Earth who had gone to this other planet. The reason why the society had developed was because of the existential threat of this parasite called Thread, which came from another planet, and they had to order their society in a way that protected against it, but they lost a lot of the technology that they used to have, but it feels like fantasy, but it's science. I've kind of done a flip with that with my Toy Soldier Saga. It's a space opera, and it's got all that stuff. There's alien species, there's faster than light travel, there's different planets, there's big wars and conflicts that, the threat of worlds is in the balance and all this stuff, but it's all fantasy. It's all accomplished through mystical means. There is no, warp drive. There's magical power that does this. There's erts instead of wormholes, right? And so it's like a flip. It's a flip of the tropes. And then another example of a science fantasy is Andre Norton. She wrote stuff that I didn't realize what it was at the time, but now that I've read it again, and I've read Edgar Rice Burroughs and his Barsoom series, the John Carter of Mars stuff, right?
Yeah, his Tarzan too could be considered fantasy.
Sure, yeah, absolutely, it's fantasy. Of course it is, and they just called it all adventure fiction at the time, right? But he's got these mythological places, and Tarzan's a superhero, right? So is John Carter of Mars, really, except that he's meeting Martians and he's doing all this stuff. Andre Norton's writing that, except that she's flipping the tropes in that it's absolutely all science with a touch of magic, because we don't really know exactly how her witches are doing things, except that she explains that through a pseudoscience kind of method eventually. And then, but she was flipping the tropes because okay, anybody who's read Edgar Rice Burroughs knows that it's sexist, right? It's sexist and it's racist. And you can't deny this.
Yeah.
It's a product of its time.
Well, it is. Yeah. I mean, like, you know, I'm not going to say, oh, he's a horrible man. No, of course it was a product of its time, right? She was flipping that trope. She was making it all about the witches. And it's like a feminist take on Edgar Rice Burroughs. Right? So these are examples, famous examples of people who have pushed the limit there.
There were many. It's quite common amongst the classic sci-fi. One of my favorites is Roger Zelazny. He's done Lord of Light and Creatures of Light and Darkness. Both of them are mythological creatures with a technological basis. Lord of Light is Hindu mythology. Creatures of Light and Darkness is Egyptian mythology. They're both very highly advanced technological societies. It's all technology under that, except that it feels just like magic because they're all gods among men.
Yeah, Lord of Light was an amazing book. I really enjoyed that one. It's one of my favorites. I don't know, anybody else got examples of people that they think of when they think of fantasy mashups, people who may have inspired them?
Well, Jim Butcher is a good example in his Harry Dresden series. He's a good example of the fantasy detective mashup.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, yeah, he started or was a main contributor to the private detective in a fantasy setting. So
yeah,
a very classical noir 90s 20 kind of hardboiled detective, but set in modern day and dealing with the paranormal.
Yeah, and that was new, right? When he was doing it, that was new, and now we see it all the time, right?
Yeah.
Now we're
because his book did so well, and people loved them so much that other writers said, "Wow, you know, let's try it," and now it's a big thing.
I doubt anybody thinks about this now when they think about fantasy mashups too. But in a way, Harry Potter was also a fantasy mashup. It was a blend of those boarding school MacDonald Hall type books with fantasy elements.
Yeah,
right?
it's also a coming of age story too. So those.
Right, a Bildungsroman.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to mention Harry Potter, but I wasn't quite sure. But yeah, you're right. It's kind of that young adult, typical kind of young adult love, romancy thing mixed with all that magic and the sword and sorcery stuff. And of course, Dune.
Okay, I'm going to bring in the weird one. Christine Feehan has a series, the Carpathian series, and it's romances based on vampirism, but she does a lot of science-y type explanations for it. Like, it's very sci-fantasy. It's technically romances.
Yeah, two things I could relate to there, right? One is that we now have this whole genre, paranormal romance. And when it started, right, that was just, okay, we're going to take romance novels and we're going to add vampires, right? And because that whole, I don't know, when was that successful? True Blood, right? When did that become really big?
Oh, no.
Earlier than that?
It's Twilight.
No.
Okay, hold on, because before then, Anne Rice, Vampire Chronicles.
Yeah, but
but that wasn't so romancy.
Yeah, that was more gothic, I think, than romance.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
But also a lot of erotica and a lot of homoerotica. I was okay. So this is what I was reading when I was a teenager. When most people now are reading Twilight, apparently, a little bit more intense. And you see the evolution, right? Like, I agree with you. I don't think it's romance, but the line's thin, so you can see where Twilight took it into the realm of romance, sort of inspired by that.
I was reading romance of the paranormal bent, in high school. So that was like 90s. That was way before Twilight.
It's just that Twilight made it huge and made it the genre.
It did, yeah. Well, and the thing about paranormal romance is one of the tropes of it is it does tend to be a little more graphic than, the average romance. And so, I used to joke that I could tell what kind of paranormal creature it was based on what kind of sexual kink was featured in the paranormal romance. Because you had these dragons were bondage.
Really?
Sure, yeah.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, sure.
Well, that makes sense. You know.
Vampires are life mates. Werewolves are life mates too, but it's very more kinky.
More hairy.
Fairies tend to really ride the line on LGBTQ issues, so yeah, but yeah. I mean, I could literally pick up a book and based on what kink is featured, I could tell you what kind of creature was also featured.
You know what's interesting about Twilight? It's not really my cup of tea whatsoever. But the interesting thing about it is it wasn't just doing fantasy and romance, fantasy and romance mixed together, but it was also taking it into that teen, young adult thing. So it wasn't kink, and not really. I mean, it skirts it, but it was very light fare in comparison. Wasn't erotic and all that. So now that's the big thing, right? Or was. I don't know if it's as much now. It's not my thing. I mean, I like some paranormal romance, but it certainly makes me think about how popular young adult is. And this is an issue in my book series, Shiva 14, where it's a coming of age story. And so the first book, he starts off 14. Well, he starts off a baby, but it's mostly him at 14. And he's trying to figure out who he is, what kind of person he's going to be, all that teenage stuff mixed with being the Messiah. It's not a young adult story. This is a very adult story. And I have to have a disclaimer on it because it's mature themes. There's sex, there's violence. It's epic. There's battles. It takes him all the way till he's about 20. So yeah, it skirts the line on like young adult, but it's not. Again, another mashup, but I think older teens are ready for that, especially because of things like the paranormal romance.
I run into the same issue. Both of my series start as coming of age stories, and then everything happens from there. And Toy Soldier especially, it's a war story. Right. So there's torture, there's a prison camp that you'd recognize from World War II. There's some really horrible things that happen to the characters. There's weapons of mass destruction. It's not a nice book, right? Like, it's not a nice story. But the thing is, right, like, okay, I'm 42, and when I was a teenager, there wasn't a lot of this young adult stuff. You had kids fiction, and you had grown-up fiction. Because I was one of those precocious readers, I was reading adult fiction very young. You might say, oh, well, is that appropriate? Well, as long as you understand it.
When I was growing up, there was picture books and books. So, yeah.
Wait, did you actually grow up in ancient Rome?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay. No wonder, you're a time traveler. Awesome.
It's the doctor.
No, it's
you're the doctor.
I think that the classification and obsession with classification changed over time as well. I mean, really, when I was growing up, there were picture book for small kids, so Enid Blyton and the likes for primary schooler, and then it was just books after that.
Yeah, I was reading weird stuff. I was the first book, believe it or not, that I ever really, really enjoyed reading a book was Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. And that was because my mother said, here, I think you're going to like this. Because I was always a kid that just wasn't interested in many of the typical books we were given. Like Tom Sawyer didn't interest me at all. I was always kind of more on the, I guess, deep thinker side. And I wanted stuff that really took me outside of my realm. So the East and all of that. But I also, started getting into the Clan of the Cave Bear stuff. And books that were not for typical kids. When we were talking about books that challenge young adults as well, I thought of Philip Pullman and the Dark Materials. That's a big mashup. That's huge. It is definitely a cross between fantasy, young adult, sci-fi, all of it. And it challenges so much in society. So that's definitely a book that stayed with me.
Yeah, you've got a point there. I mean, like, they were willing enough to make the first movie, but when it came to, okay, we're going to start challenging God, they didn't want to go there in Hollywood, right?
Which they probably should have thought about that before doing the first movie, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't think the first movie made a lot of money either, which probably
it did overseas.
Yeah, Harry Potter's a bit like that too, right? See, this is why I'm not worried too much about the classification of, okay, is a young adult, is a new adult, whatever, because Harry Potter grew as the kids grew. You know, the first book is very, you know, it's appropriate for the age. By the time that you reach the last book, right, it's older teens, new adults for sure. There's complex stuff going on, and it's the language plus the subject matter that's covered, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think over much about that.
I think parents are more worried about it than the kids are.
The stuff my kids read, and they read a lot more advanced stuff than we'd give them credit for. Probably, you know, about as advanced as we read it. I read Herman Hesse's Siddhartha at 14, I think. Been reading it once a decade ever since.
Awesome.
All this, like, for example, the Sarah J. Maas and Harry Potter, etc. They can get quite graphic and quite complex in what they depict, in the themes that they deal with. And kids seem to be getting it fairly well, a lot better than adults think sometimes. So I still told them not to read my books, but for the same
Are
reasons,
you graphic?
No, there's no graphic, sexual, or anything, but
The heart.
it's adult themes essentially. As Lyra said, it can get a bit dark at times.
I think Weird West is appropriate for most teenagers. I would question Toy Soldier. I think you should be at least an older teen. Actually, okay, historical fantasy. This is something that I have a special interest in, because one thing that I like to do, I like to read historical fiction, right? Like that's my go-to when I'm not reading science fiction fantasy. The question, I think, is where do you draw the line, and why does it matter? Because it depends on how it's marketed. Clan of the Cave Bear. We just mentioned Clan of the Cave Bear. Clan of the Cave Bear, as you know, I mean, it's historical fiction, and that's typically how it's marketed. But it goes into certain metaphysical elements, and you have to kind of go, all right, is that unreliable narrator, or what's going on there, right? The Gears, I forget both their first names, but they write all those, people of the river. They're archaeologists, right? And so they write very much from this whole, okay, this is what we know from this archaeological study of this particular First Nations culture. But the characters are of their time, and they believe in certain metaphysical elements, and these metaphysical elements have a bearing on the plot. And so you kind of have to treat it as part of it. So I noticed that it tends to be marketed as historical fiction, but I see these very strong fantasy elements, and it even has that mythic, there's this, the whole fate of the culture's at stake, huge things going on. So why do you think they would do that? And do you think that that's the way people should do it?
I think mythological and metaphysical fantasy elements are perceived a little different than the regular fantasy elements, which may be why it gets classified as historical fiction more than fantasy.
I'd say that just historical fiction is a far larger category. There's more people who are willing to read historical fiction rather than fantasy. And if the focus is on history with some elements, then yes, people will probably be easier to reach through the historical fiction channels rather than anything else. There are subcategories for metaphysical or inspirational, etc. Fiction, both within historical fiction and in general. But when you take it something like Clan of the Cave Bears, it's not strong on the fantasy elements. It is more about prehistory setting. If you look at any historical fantasy a bit more narrowly, I think when you have a focus on an historical setting, when history does play a major part in and of itself, together with some fantastical elements, then it becomes historical fantasy. It could be magic. You take a time period and add magic. It could be steampunk, when you take a particular time period and add technological elements. Sometimes even just alt history, when it's what would happen if some event took place differently, and you add some fantastical element to that, then it becomes historical fantasy. It's one of my favorite mashups as well, if you haven't picked up on that yet. I think it's not easy to market these type of novels to historical fiction. So Clan of the Cave Bears, etc., they have some metaphysical or paranormal elements, but the historical fiction broader community will say, hey, okay, it's representative of people at the time. Whereas if you take something like my books, based on Rome with magic, or steampunk, which is Victorian England with advanced technology, historical fiction readers will take a look at it and say, I don't know what that is. That's not what I signed up for. So I think that's kind of the distinctive line between the two.
I think it depends on how much of one category is in it versus another. Like Asaf was saying, if it's mostly historical, if it's mostly fantasy, it just kind of depends on how people will see it. And that does get into a gray line. Like I'm about to embark on a new series where it's going to be the sort of slightly Harry Potterish, where there's a young adult aspect of modern times, and then it's going to have time travel. It's going to go back into, it's going to be Arthurian. You know, I'm going to have to research like crazy about a lot of things. It's going to take place in Isle of Man in the modern times and back in time. So it's going to be like all over the place. Now that, of course, would be just what urban fantasy, I guess. But it depends on what it mostly is. You know, there's time travel in Shiva, but it's like mostly at the end of the book.
I think probably a step back about why blending genres or why genres are so important. The only reason the genre label is important is to reach the target audience. You're trying to reach people and tell them very quickly, this is kind of what it's about. So if you're into that, you'll enjoy it. If you're not, you won't. That's why you classify things. You put them together on a shelf. Oh, look, this is historical romance. You know, do you like history, like romance? This is the shelf you go to. You pick up. You have an idea of what you'll expect. If you suddenly add, Dracula, for example, paranormal historical romance. If you put that on a historical romance shelf, people might look at it and say, where did that come from? It's really about reaching your target audience and advertising. This is what it's about. These are the elements, or the key elements that are in there that you can expect. And if you like them, you'll probably enjoy this.
Okay, actually, this is an interesting thing I want to throw out there. We have so many subcategories now of genres. You know, we have grimdark and noble bright and, you know, all this other stuff. Is it time to blow the lid off and not bother with this whole idea of genre? Case in point, Asaf says, more people will read historical fiction than fantasy. But I challenge that because, you know, like it depends on, you know, if you say it's fantasy, but do you guys know anybody who hasn't seen the Avengers? I know one person, my mother. That's it, right? So obviously more people like fantasy than are claiming they like fantasy.
But it's not labeled as fantasy.
Right.
It's labeled as superhero, which is another genre. So, I mean, so maybe genres do count. If you had labeled it fantasy, would they have gone and seen it? That's the question.
But how the hell did they get away with calling superheroes their own genre when that's clearly science fantasy?
Oh,
right?
I
Because
agree.
it's
But I mean,
pseudoscience, right?
this is what happens with a lot of these genres. They suddenly become their own little thing, like steampunk. It's clearly fantasy and little science fiction mixed in and with history, but it's its own little thing. And it even has subgenres now, like clock punk and diesel punk.
Yeah.
And
cattle punk.
Yes, and half a dozen other punks I can't remember right now. But so I mean, they sort of take on a life of their own because they become popular and stuff. And
I can't keep track of all that. That's hard. I have a hard enough time with just space opera versus science fantasy. It's like I guess it's both, and two things is hard enough for me, let alone all that.
I still don't know what space opera is really.
I don't like the term. I hate it. It makes me think of cheesy, Flash Gordon. Not that there isn't a place for that, but that's not what I write. My stuff is much more metaphysical. It has battles and all that stuff, but
Flash Gordon is ray gun gothic space opera.
But the problem is we don't create categories for ourselves. We do not create categories for ourselves. And as a consumer, not as a producer of these things, there are times when I want to watch a superhero movie and I ain't going to watch anything else. And if I can't find a superhero movie, then I'm not watching anything because I want a certain thing.
Yeah.
And there are times when I want steampunk. There are times that I want Western fantasy. There are times that I want sci-fantasy. And if that's what I want, that's what I want. And I'm not going to settle for anything else. And if you don't make it easy for me, then you're not going to get consumed. Right. So, I mean, I think that, it's complicated from the creator's perspective, but we don't do that for our, we don't care what our book is going to be labeled. It doesn't like change who we are or what we've made. We need to do this for our consumers.
Yep. I very, very much agree with what Sarah said. When we create, we write what we want, the story that we want to read or the story that we want to write. The genre becomes important when we're trying to market it later on. So we're trying to reach a particular group. If Sarah's in the mood for superheroes, then if it doesn't have superheroes on the label, or at least someone in wearing the underwear over the spandex, then yeah, it's not going to reach the right audience. That's what the genre labels.
I agree, because I mean, as a reader, like say if I'm going to buy a romance novel, I'm probably going to lean more toward historical romance as opposed to paranormal romance or contemporary romance, because that's what I like to read. And the same with fantasy. If I'm looking for a fantasy, I'll probably lean more towards epic or sword and sorcery than say urban fantasy.
It's an interesting point.
Just because somebody likes a certain genre or subgenre doesn't mean they never deviate from that genre. In fact, it's very common.
Yeah, that's
but
true.
Sometimes I want a mail order bride romance, and sometimes I want a a historical mystery, and you get in a mood for things, and it doesn't do us any good to make it hard for our consumers to find what they want.
Then the question becomes, what label do we use? Like, okay, this is an interesting point that I found, right? Okay, so you know my Weird West stuff. I put it out there and I'm like, okay, yeah, and it also kind of falls under dystopia, right? So I joined this group on Facebook called the Band of Dystopian Authors and Fans. This is an awesome group. These people are really cool. I found a huge audience there. All of a sudden, this, which that was a surprise to me. I was like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that, and people were going, oh, yeah, this is like Fallout meets Firefly. This is great. And I'm like, yeah, I guess so, eh? Because I didn't know how to reach that group, but there's a group that really took off with it. So should I classify it primarily under dystopia?
Well, dystopia is really popular right now. So yes, you should. I don't like it, but it's huge.
And that goes into, it's very anxiety inducing to try and figure out what to classify your book as. I'm totally respecting and honoring that particular, storm of emotions, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think the readers are quite as anal about it. Maybe the authors and, the super fans, extremists.
Authors tend to care about it because we need to put it in some category in Amazon or any other store. It needs to go on a certain shelf for people to find it, and we try to find the shelf that will appeal to the largest number of people. Marketing level, I'm active in historical fiction groups, so people who read historical fiction, and so in just Roman history groups. I'm active in fantasy groups, in grimdark groups, because my stuff tend to be a bit horror in it. So anything that's sort of around that area, there's a certain overlap. So I'm active there, and I try to make it explicit. If you come from a Roman detective background, so if you like Lindsay Saylor, etc., so Lindsay Davis and Stephen Saylor and their works, you might like mine if you like a bit of fantasy thrown in. Or if you like Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, hey, you might like mine, if you don't mind it's being set 2,000 years in the past. So it's kind of different tags to different groups, but it's always trying to reach those kind of audiences, the people who have a shared interest, and you're trying to set up, okay, if you're also interested in a little bit outside of that, in this direction, you might enjoy it.
Yeah, like Sarah said, I think that people do like what they like, but they also are willing to deviate a little bit for the most part.
Yeah, like when I go to Barnes & Noble, I go straight for fantasy, but I also stop at a couple other, sections. If I don't see something that I really want in fantasy, then there are other places that I hit. I have my favorites. There are certain sections that I just don't go into because I've never been interested in them, and I've never found anything that would change my mind about that. It's not like I only go to one section. It's not like, that we talk about putting it on which shelf. We don't look at just one shelf, though.
Yeah, and I may not like dystopian, but I am interested in Diane's books. They sound awesome. So, deviance is good. I mean, I love different things.
Weirdly, I don't tend to get a lot of traction from people who are into Westerns. They are so against the idea. I know, right? Okay, the last book that I just finished, which is, it's coming out at the end of the month, like, you could take the whole thing, and aside from a couple of details, it's a Western story. There's like some minor things in there. You could rub them out. It would make no difference to the rest of the story. It's a Western. And no Western reader is going to read it because they're like, elves, magic, blah.
How dare you put that in there?
Right, exactly. I've offended them, So that's the thing, right?
I'm sure there are some who really like that.
That goes back to the whole idea of the feel and the tropes and, kind of the expectations of the reader. I've seriously considered whether or not I should keep the Runespells as an urban fantasy because there's no sex in there. It's a female character with no sex, and it's urban fantasy. And people are like, are there vampires? No, no vampires either.
That's actually urban fantasy rather than paranormal romance.
But,
I'm so happy those genres finally split apart.
Well, yeah, but the problem is that there are so many urban fantasies that have those aspects to them that the readers have begun to expect that.
A good point. And it's different too, again, right? Like the Dresden Files. The Dresden Files are urban fantasy. Nobody's arguing with that, but that's a male main character, so
Oh, so he doesn't have to have sex.
That's right! Apparently!
He does. He does, though.
Yeah, he does, but
not often,
nobody would care if he didn't.
Right?
I'm sorry, I'm looking at your background there. Have you given the Spawn a ride? That's cool.
Yes, that was a red cap on top of an ogre that you just saw.
Fantasy mashup.
That's my life.
Okay, I think we've touched on it briefly. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add in this field. What do we feel people are going to get out of a mashup more than what you would call, whatever the standard fantasy thing is?
For me and for other readers as well, it's an escape so much, more than just regular one genre, but like real escape. Like you could just go anywhere at any time and do anything. It's just freedom and escape and just I think that you can get more out of it with a mashup than with just staying in one setting or one culture or one feel of something. If you have the exploration, you can just do anything, and that's amazing and wonderful to me. It's what I'm attracted to.
I guess for me, it's kind of like a 2-for-1 sort of deal. It's like, because I read like a lot of different genres, so if I find a book that mashes up two of them I like mystery or fantasy and history, then it's sort of like getting those two genres in one book, one price. Instead of buying two books, you get one book.
It's a bargain.
Sure.
Yeah. That's what it is. It's a bargain.
I think you get to explore settings that are different than your usual hunting ground. It's a unique combination that can open your eyes and then shed light on aspects that you never thought about in your main areas of interest.
I think of it as a way to bring in things that I normally would not be at all interested in, or, like my dad and my grandpa always watched Westerns. And so there's like 2 or 3 Westerns that I absolutely love, and the rest of them I'm just like, nah. Then you get things that are a blend of things. Like we just watched the Winona Earp series.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of a modern Western fantasy zombie apocalypse kind of thing. And I loved it because it had that kind of like almost nostalgia feel of, watching these Westerns with my family, but it was much more on the topic that I prefer.
As a writer, and I don't know, I hope the readers will get similar things out of it, okay? George R.R. Martin likes to take the tropes of fantasy and flip them. That's what he likes to do. He's like, okay, let's blow them all up and see what happens. Let's shatter them. I don't do that. I like to take the tropes that, I like and I've come to expect in the things that I read. And then, okay, so what if they were real, right? What if they really were a thing? What would be the natural consequences of that? And I like to explore that. Often I find that they don't quite stay in the box that has been established. You know, okay, another thing, I guess another project, I mentioned it briefly in the gender issues panel, right? I'm working on a high fantasy with a transgender main character, which was accomplished through magic. It's a lost heir reclaiming the throne story. But he's got to do it through military strategy. So I'm looking at this, right? If there really was a lost heir to a magical kingdom, what would, would people just go, oh, you're the lost heir, okay, I'll follow you, and that happens in fantasy literature all the time. In real life, probably not. People are gonna be like, well, what's in it for me, or how are you going to improve the kingdom, or what the hell makes you the lost heir, and can you do the job? People are gonna be a little bit more challenging of that. So it gives when you blend the genres, right, it gives you an opportunity to explore those aspects. So I love that. I love reading it, and I hope that, I love writing it. I hope that my readers like it.
Realism is definitely important in any book, I think, but when you get to blend like sci-fi and fantasy together, you got to have some level of realism, otherwise it just doesn't work. I think you get to explore so much more when you blend genres, and for a reader and a writer, and it's just the best.
Do you guys have anything else that you want to add, something that I didn't bring up that you'd like to discuss that relates to the panel subject, or buy my book, please? I don't know, whatever.
I think I ended it well. You guys good?
Everybody's good?
All right. It was awesome.
Yes, this was a lot of fun. Thanks, everyone, for joining me tonight. This was good, and
Thanks for hosting.
Yeah.
Lots of fun.
Yeah, thank you.
I really enjoyed it.
Awesome.
Yeah, hopefully I can talk to you all again in the future.
I hope so.
Our information will be in the comments below the video, so look us up if anything that we've discussed is something that you'd be interested in. And I'm going to keep my eye on the panels. I'm going to make a playlist on my own channel. So if you have any questions, ask them, and I'll answer to the best of my ability. I'm sure my fellow panelists will do the same.
Definitely. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.